beginning. Thanks for getting the recording going. And then let each of them speak in succession, and then we'll have conversation at the end. Our presenters are Melissa Johnson, Ella Bucknell, and Leah Mackin. Melissa Johnson is Associate Professor of Art History and Visual Culture at Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois. Her research and teaching focuses on the histories of craft and its intersections with modern and contemporary art. Her recent publications include A Desire in the Process of Becoming, which is an essay written for the exhibition Strange Oscillations and Vibrations of Sympathy, which featured women artists responding to the work of women authors. And also, and I apologize for my mangling of German here, also Italy Zervult, Hannah Huck's Dadaist Italienreise, as well as an audio narration of the exhibition Shift, Rotate, Reflect, Selected Works 1997 to 2020 by Jen Bervin. She's currently working on a project that examines artists who make work in response to the writings of Virginia Woolf. This academic writing parallels her text and textile-based work practices. She's working on two textile projects, Woolf Words and Tactile Investigations, as well as a writing and studio project on mending and repair. Our second presenter will be Ella Bucknell. She is a writer and illustrator from London, currently working on a graphic biography of Virginia Woolf, which will be published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in the UK and Pantheon in the US. Ella is also a London Arts and Humanities Partnership funded PhD candidate in creative writing at King's College London. And our third presenter will be Leah Mackin. She's a visual artist and educator who explores themes of reflection, response, and recreation or recreation, I think is the better pronunciation, through performative publishing projects. She holds an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and a BFA in printmaking and book arts from the University of the Arts. Her artist's works are held in over 25 library collections in the United States. I'm so excited for all of these presentations. I am going to drop Melissa's access paper, the links, to Melissa's access paper and slides in the chat here, and then we can get going.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, great.
And please. Okay. Oops. All right. Are you seeing that correctly?
Yes,
okay.
That looks good.
Thanks. All right, thank you, Catherine, for organizing us. I'm excited to tell you about my work today, and I'm also excited to hear Ella and Leah talk about their work as well. Woolf's writing, especially The Waves and To the Lighthouse, asks me to respond. Rolling me over, the waves will shoulder me under. From the waves, passes through my body as I read and moves me physically and emotionally. This phrase initiated and brought together the two projects I'll speak about today, Woolf Words and Tactile Investigations. These projects have allowed me to read Woolf closely and associatively. I'm drawn to the textural and gestural in her vocabulary. I'm drawn to how she describes bodies situated and moving in space and in relation to objects. And so I read Woolf slowly, often out loud, keeping an ear out for phrases that speak of sensations and emotions, of embodiment and textiles. Some phrases prompt me to ask, what would this look like stitched? Today, I'll show you work from these projects and discuss my practice and the ideas and individuals who inform it. I've shared a Google Doc as well as a slideshow, so you can look more closely at the stitched pieces and at the poems that time won't allow me to read aloud. Most simply, I write conceptually and stitch abstractly and intuitively. Using an online concordance, I search for words and extract phrases from Woolf's writing with which I resonate. I first began with waves, but soon began searching for other words, many other words. Using a concordance allows me to work with the element of chance. Chance helps me discover what I wouldn't necessarily find while reading Woolf page by page. I copy, paste, and reformat the extracted phrases in Word. I then select lines to print or type with my 1930s Royal Manual typewriter. And I cut the phrases into strips, which I then place in an envelope. From here, I might sort the phrases into groups based on words, ideas, or motifs. Or I might play with the chance encounters that emerge when I pull a handful of phrases from an envelope. From these phrases, I create a poem, which I photograph. When I type, I must strike the keys with pressure and intention. I sometimes make mistakes, but typing allows me to directly experience Woolf's words. I shift the placement of words from prose to poetry, but keep Woolf's punctuation and capitalization. Sometimes phrases stand on their own, but I also combine them collage style, creating new readings and meanings through juxtaposition. My decision to combine Woolf's phrases through common words and ideas has helped me discover a formal or structural vocabulary to Woolf's writing, important to this studio work, but also for my academic work. I've been exploring this in a sketch of the past, the waves to the lighthouse and a room of one's own. One of my favorite phrases, when the white arm rests upon the knee, it is a triangle, is from the waves. It's about form, shape, and line. It makes me think of the purple triangle Lily Briscoe paints to depict Mrs. Ramsay reading to James. The phrase is from the first dinner scene with Percival. Rhoda is describing how she travels in her imagination from the dinner table where she sits to India. When I read this phrase, found through the concordance, but now in the context of its paragraph, I discovered in the last sentence an overlap between the waves and a room of one's own that expands my reading of Woolf. Rhoda says, always I see the grove over your heads, between your shoulders, or from a window when I have crossed the room at a party and stand looking down into the street. Rhoda stands at a window looking down at a street below, as does the narrator of A Room of One's Own, who sees a girl in patent leather boots meet a man in a maroon coat, get into a taxi cab, and drive off. Alongside the text-based work, I hand-stitch abstract pieces that visualize ideas and sensations in Woolf's writing. Each piece is done on a 4x4-inch square of wool felt using cotton embroidery floss, wool, or silk thread. I use floss that I purchased, but I also use threads gifted to me, as well as what I've inherited from my mother and maternal grandmother. They taught me to embroider when I was 6, and I stitched regularly until age 13. But in 2016, I returned to the practice when my research expanded to include a focus on craft. In 2018, I participated in a workshop at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts called Tactile Notations, led by visual artist and poet Jen Bervin. Jen prompted me to connect my Woolf words with my stitching. What, she asked, would Woolf say about your embroidery? I work in small stitches using a vocabulary I repeat but adjust and expand as I work and respond to Woolf's writing. The running stitch, seed stitch, and French knot are my most common stitches. I make a lot of these small pieces. Some are really quick because they're quite simple. Others take longer. They can be obsessive. Hundreds, maybe thousands of French knots or seed stitches take time. Others are time intensive because they're more involved, and I need to figure out as I go along what I'm going to do. I've been working on this piece off and on for several months, and it's not done yet. Woolf's textural and gestural vocabulary is important for the stitched work. In her 1917 diary, Woolf described a conversation with Roger Fry and Clive Bell. Fry asked Woolf if she founded her writing upon texture or upon structure. Woolf wrote, "I connected structure with plot and therefore said texture." Woolf's answer of texture first reminds me of the opening of the waves, where she describes the sea using metaphors of textiles. First, the sea is slightly creased as if a cloth had wrinkles, and then a gray cloth barred with thick strokes. Several sentences later, the air seemed to become fibrous and tear away from the surface of the sea and flicker in red and yellow fibers. These fibers gradually fuse into one haze, one incandescence, which lifted the weight of the woolen gray sky. But this literal attention to texture and textiles isn't exactly how Fry and Bell understood texture in painting or writing. In her essay on form, in Reading Virginia Woolf, Julia Briggs noted that Woolf might have more correctly chosen structure in answer to Fry, for structure has to do with the underlying form or framework of a work of art. And Briggs noted that after 1917, Woolf began to write with attention to the structural aspect of form. Briggs refers to Woolf's description of the butterfly and the cathedral in To the Lighthouse, in which the butterfly's fragile wing is feathery and evanescent, while the structural framework of the cathedral is clamped together with bolts of iron. I recognize a parallel in this conversation of structure and texture in painting and writing with the conversation in which textile artists, scholars, and writers engage on the linguistic relationship of text and textile. In her book, Spontaneous Particulars, The Telepathy of Archives, poet Susan Howe notes that the English word text comes from medieval Latin textus, style or texture of a work, literally thing woven, from the past participle stem of texere, to weave, to join, fit together, construct. Weavers especially turn to this historical conversation to discuss what they do. When modernist weaver Annie Albers arrived at the Bauhaus in 1922, expecting to study painting, because she was a woman, she was placed in the weaving workshop. The weaving she made throughout her career are not functional or decorative, but wall hangings intended as equivalents to modernist abstract paintings. But to make her claim, Albers argued that weaving is structural, and so necessarily she had to dismiss and diminish embroidery because it is surface-based and decorative. I bristle at this, but I note how I sometimes shy away from calling what I do embroidery. Instead, I call it stitching. I remind myself, though, that 100 years later, in 2022, this argument pitting art against craft, formal structure against decorative texture, no longer poses a problem, but instead presents a situation to work through and explore. As I think through this historical conversation, I consider how my Woolf Words and tactile investigations sit in relation to one another as text and textile. I think there's an analogy here between Woolf's consideration of structure as the underlying framework of the text of a novel and texture as the individual words, narrative, or symbolism. And I think my stitching in its abstraction disturbs this analogy. It reflects an aspect of Woolf's writing I've been considering. That Woolf thought and wrote a lot about the difficulty of words, and she recognized that sometimes words weren't adequate. I think of Lily Briscoe wishing to say something, everything to Mr. Carmichael, but words fluttered sideways and struck the object too low. Then one gave it up, for how could one express in words these emotions of the body? It was one's body feeling, not one's mind. In both the Woolf Words and tactile investigations, I create an experience that continues and reinvents some aspect of my reading Woolf. When I sit with a novel or essay by Woolf, I read page by page. The concordance, though, makes me read differently. These two ways of reading seem to offer me a macro and micro view of Woolf's work, or an aerial versus close to the ground view. I've been exploring this idea in the stitched piece I showed earlier. I've been reading Olivia Lang's To the River and Robin Wall Kimmerer's Gathering Moss alongside Woolf. I'm working with a view of a landscape scene from above. Lines of running stitch create roads and paths, French knots and seed stitches the land. But the knots and seeds also reference patches of ground or moss seen up close. Alongside the stitching, I juxtapose this collage text piece with phrases from the waves. My eyes are hard, my eyes are green leaves. I have eyes that look close to the ground and see. Reading Woolf through extraction and rereading the phrases through juxtaposition makes me think of how Sarah Ahmed writes of making arguments by listening for resonances to create a scene of feminist instruction. Woolf, in her 1937 essay Craftsmanship, gave permission to combine the old words in new orders to make something different. My responses to Woolf emerge in answer to questions posed by Woolf, as well as others whose work forms what Ahmed refers to as companion texts. Trinity Minha's strategy of speaking nearby her subjects and Maggie Nelson's act of leaning against the words of other writers are useful to me, as is a question artist Moira Davey poses. What if the most gratifying reading is the one that also entails the risks of producing a text of one's own? Appropriating from Woolf feels like a risk. How do I have the right to borrow from her? Yet my curiosity and desire pull at me to continue. And Woolf's essay, Modern Fiction, encourages me. Her call to transcribe the experience of impressions received resonates with my practice. She writes, "Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each sight or incident scores upon the consciousness." I think, yes, this feels close to what I do when I read, extract phrases from Woolf to reorder, and create the poems and stitchings, and then bring them together. I did this in a piece titled Drawing Finer and Finer the Thread Between Us. I'd posted phrases and stitchings on Instagram during the COVID lockdown between March 2020 and June 2021. For the installation, I created one long poem from the phrases and arranged the stitch pieces on either side. I'm currently planning a commonplace book of stitched pieces combined with the Woolf Words. I've been talking with an artist friend about how to bind it and/or present it. I want it to be a flexible and interchangeable binding or gathering, so the order of words and images can be played with. What does it mean for me to read Woolf this way? How am I positioned in my reading when I'm also stitching and writing poetry using her words? Roland Barthes writes, "Language is a skin. I rub my language against the other. It is as if I had words instead of fingers, or fingers at the tip of my words. My language trembles with desire." Barthes' statement makes me think of two phrases from the waves: rubbing my eyes along surfaces that thin, and this rubbing of my nose along the surfaces of things. This is the feeling of Woolf's words as they travel through my body when I read, through my fingers as I stitch, even my nose as I bend close to the felt. I'm trying to convey the visuality and materiality of Woolf's language in the phrases chosen and the stitches made. I want to revel in and enjoy her words. I want to read her with a sense of open curiosity and an analytical but affective lens. Thank you.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much. And I see that Madeline has commented in the chat that we're having resonances with the presentation this morning of the wonderful work on the COVID-19 diary and the letterpress. So maybe that'll be something we'll come back to in the discussion afterwards. Ella, I think we're ready for you to share your screen. If you're ready to share your screen with us.
I am ready. I've also just shared in the chat a link to a Google document which should have the transcript. I'm afraid I haven't footnoted it. I slightly ran out of time, so apologies for that. And also apologies, my screen sometimes seems to be doing this strange blurry thing. So if it starts doing that, I'm very sorry, but hopefully it won't. Let me just share that. Okay. A sketch of the past, illustration as biography, and the ethics of writing lives. In this paper, I will explore Woolf's anxieties over both the viability and the ethics of biography. I will describe my own practice as a graphic biographer and how illustration has facilitated me in my attempts to, at Virginia's bequest, marry the granite-like solidity of truth and the rainbow-like intangibility of personality, and weld these two into one seamless whole. Part 1. I am made and remade continually. The viability of biography in the case for the graphic biography. A few years ago at a party, I overheard a friend describing me to their new boyfriend. Ella's an artist who's obsessed with Virginia Woolf. It was disorienting to hear myself so crisply encapsulated. In fact, I felt rather like a captured moth, drunk suddenly and pinned down against my will. Virginia herself dislikes the idea of being pinpointed. In a diary entry in 1933, she writes, "I meet somebody who says you're this or that, and I don't want to be anything." She fled from ego. Sydney comes and I'm Virginia. When I write, I'm merely a sensibility. Sometimes I like being Virginia, but only when I'm scattered and various and gregarious. It is true that in my biographizing, I have sometimes found Virginia to be a slippery subject. Often, just at the moments I feel that I might have grasped something tangible about her life, Virginia Woolf the woman will melt away. She teases me. I have escaped you. I have gone buzzing like a swarm of bees, endlessly vagrant. Virginia was, like her father, the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography, obsessed with lives, but she interrogated his legacy, questioning how well one can know a person at all. "Do you think it possible to write a life of anyone?" she asks. "I doubt it, because people are all over the place." For Virginia, people are amorphous, amphibious. They live both on the surface and in the depths. This is a photo I took of one of my early sketchbooks on Woolf when I was practicing drawing her face. In the photo, one sketch of Woolf is seen through another as the paper is made translucent in the light. I was struck by the image, how it seemed to capture her multitudes, as well as her resistance as the subject of both biography and portraiture to being pinpointed, flattened. Virginia herself wrote 3 biographies, Orlando Flesh and Roger Fry, which were all in their own way playful, irreverent, and challenging. Hermione Lee describes how Woolf's biographies are comparable to work done by the painters she knew. Domestic, impressionistic, irreverent, informal portraits which sought the essence of character through colour and form. In Vanessa Bell's portrait of Woolf here, in her painter's looseness, in the obscurity of Woolf's face, Bell manages to signal the impossibility of accessing the inner world of another person, and at the same time, she seems to have abstracted Virginia's essence, in the colours, in her posture, in her absorption in her task, her concentrated industry. This is how I imagine Melissa stitching as well. Woolf's Orlando and Flush both veer formally into what we might call biofiction. I believe that by making explicit the fictionalizing process that is always naturally a part of writing biography, Woolf is able to overcome some of her anxieties about the viability of biographical endeavour. Laura Kerner argues that a biographical novel can, in fact, bring out a truth about a real person in a more poignant way than would a factual account. Biofiction is elastic. Within it, the biographer has the opportunity to fragment and to synthesize, to distill the essence of their subject. It was important to me when I first decided to create something biographical about Virginia's life, to find an approach that I thought she would approve of, one that might best achieve that queer amalgamation of dream and reality, that perpetual marriage of granite and rainbow, that she believed made for a successful piece of life writing. Graphic biography, or what might perhaps better be described as graphic biofiction, is perfect for Virginia because it is deviant by virtue of its medium. It necessitates a heightened level of self-consciousness in its reading because each illustration is so clearly mediated through an artist's hand. As Jared Gardner writes, the line brings us back to the embodied author, whose signature on the page remains as unique and idiosyncratic as an autograph. A graphic biography is then by nature a subjective interpretation and a personal response, rather than an authoritative, singular account of a person who always so adamantly maintained that she was not singular, but scattered and various and gregarious. Part 2, working towards a new biography, my practice as a graphic biographer. The dialogue between words and image in a graphic biography allows for various different biographical methodologies to occur at the same time. In this double-page spread from my book, most of the words are Virginia's own. She was the whole thing, the creator of that crowded merry world, which spun so gaily at the centre of my childhood. Here, the words are the authentic part, the hard granite fact, while the illustration is purely dream world. It is the rainbow. In the quilts that Julia Stephen is stitching here, I've sewn in previous panels from the book. You may notice Talent House, for instance. Oops, sorry, missed one. Or Toby swinging a cricket bat, or Sophie scraping fish scales with a sharp knife onto a wooden board. I've included these in order to help portray Virginia's mother as the creator figure from Virginia's childhood, as she describes her in her memoir. At the same time, because the patches are illustrations that I have drawn, I also nod towards the world building that I am currently involved in. By foregrounding my presence as biographer, I remind the reader that the biography is not all objective fact, but a personal response, or to use Monica Latham's words, a slice of life built in the spirit of Virginia Woolf. Elsewhere in the book, the images have more of granite fact to them, while the text utilizes invention. For example, this panel is demonstrably an illustration of Talent House, a rather simple drawing copied from a photograph. The text reads, when her father first discovered this house at the very toenail of England, Virginia was still just a comma in the womb, still listening every day to the sound of her mother's body whirring softly like the inside of a conch. I do not know whether Virginia's mother's womb really whirred softly like a conch. I made that up. I do, however, know that Virginia Woolf's earliest memory was the sound of the sea in St. Ives. So by using the sea imagery here, I'm attempting to bring out something that feels more essential about Woolf in the text, while the illustration is more grounded in reality. Virginia suggests that the biographer print fully, completely, accurately the known facts without comments, and then write the life as a fiction. In my graphic biography, I've tried to do this by alternating between a more traditional past tense, as in the left-hand page, and a fictional present tense, as in the right-hand page, using a black background and a white background to differentiate between the sections. In these first three panels, I start the book where a traditional biographer might, with Woolf's parents. Virginia Woolf did not believe in God. Her mother had flung aside religion after her first husband had, on stretching to pick a fig, burst an abscess and promptly died. She was left with 2 young children and expecting a third. As I move into the present tense, I begin with a more romantic origin story that she herself described in her memoir, her slow awakening in St. Ives when she heard the waves breaking 1, 2, 1, 2. In these first few panels, I've tried to draw the folds of her sheets as if they are waves sending a splash of water over the beach and withdrawing. By narrowing the temporal gap between Woolf and the reader, I'm able in the present tense to draw the reader closer to her. It helps bring her back to life. Monica Latham writes how, in biofiction, time is elastic and fluctuant, allowing prolepses and analepses, as well as close-ups and freeze frames on details or epiphanic moments laden with utmost significance. In a graphic biography, these close-ups and freeze frames can be literal. For instance, in these panels, I tried to draw out a moment of disconnect between Virginia and her mother by edging nearer towards each face, as Virginia, increasingly desperate, tries telepathically to draw the attention of her mother and is unable to penetrate her. From the third panel, it reads, her mother does not look back at her. Virginia waits for her, longs for her to look back, but she is preoccupied, dipping into some private sorrow. The form of sequential panels offers the graphic biographer even greater opportunity to manipulate time. A full page or double page spread can add weight to a moment or give the reader time to ruminate and pause, like here, for instance, where I also utilize the silence of a wordless image. Whereas here, the size and shape of the panels sends the reader whirling ahead. I'll just read the first few lines of those. Virginia runs out of the nursery and down the stairs, dodging her father, who is muttering to himself and slipping a hunk of cheese into his pocket. The mark making in a graphic biography can be playful and unconventional, and lines can be literally stepped over. In Woolfian tradition, my publisher and I are aiming for every aspect of the book's design to provoke and destabilize traditional biographical form. The book will be printed in a format, either Crown Quarto or Royal, that will enable it to sit neatly within biography shelves as well as within graphic novel shelves. And every aspect of the design will aim to play with or pastiche convention, from illustrated contents pages to footnotes, such as you can see here. Part 3. I have been dead and yet am now alive again, the ethics of biography. Virginia was acutely aware of the power imbalance at play between the biographer and their mute subject, the conjecturing and ventriloquizing that biography can entail. As Amber Pullier describes, pilgrim poets palimpsestously inscribe themselves onto the graves of their subjects, asserting their living creative agency in contrast to the dead poet's silence. In this image from an early draft of my book, I've responded to an excerpt from Woolf's essay, I Am Christina Rossetti, in which she writes, here is the past, sorry to paraphrase, here is the past and all its inhabitants sealed as in a magic tank. They thought when they were alive that they could go where they liked, and they believed when they were alive that they said straight off whatever came into their heads. But once you're in a biography, all is different. In this illustration, I show myself as a voyeur, gawping at Virginia as if she were a captive fish in an aquarium. Of course, as her biographer, I'm also puppet master, reanimating her against her will. It was during a heat wave when I drew this piece, hunched over my desk late at night, scribbling maniacally, trying to get it finished for my final MA illustration project on Virginia Woolf, when I noticed that an enormous moth had settled on the bare plaster wall. I examined it carefully and counted its spots. The very large, still presence stayed with me throughout the night, watching me work. I took it to be a reminder that Virginia Woolf will never quite be pinned down by any portrait or biography that I can draw. And yet it felt at the same time strangely like a blessing. There is no way of ever knowing whether a dead person would sanction or even enjoy a biography that is written of them. But part of me thinks that Virginia would quite like to know that she was still being remembered in this conference, in academic papers, in portraits, in traditional biographies, as well as graphic biographies, and biographical novels and plays and ballets. When Yeats died in 1939 and Auden wrote him an elegy, Virginia penned a quiet hope in her diary. I wish someone would write me a poem. Virginia, this will be mine. Thank you.
Splendid, Ella. Thank you so much. Oh my God. You can see from the effusiveness of the chat how excited we all are by this panel. Our third speaker is Leah, and I think Leah also plans to share her screen.
Yes, and I am dropping a link in the chat. Bear with me one moment.
Leah, is this the same link that I have, or shall I?
I believe that is the same. I believe that is the same link.
Okay. Well, just to be thorough, I will also drop it.
Okay. It's double time. That's likely fine.
Okay, great.
Great. Hello, all. Performative Publishing and Virginia Woolf. I approach this presentation from my role as an artist and educator, teaching publishing practices in book arts, including letterpress printing as contemporary art. I also approach this presentation with gratitude for the time and space to share my thoughts on this subject with you all. Thank you. And also with immense appreciation for my dear friend, colleague, and Shiloh McGiff. Not only did Shiloh lasso me in to participate in this conference session, but she also has been really integral in helping me tease out the ideas like this project in particular, but many others, and has supported my wanderings in scholarship and outdoor sculpture gardens and waterfalls, and hopefully more. What do I mean when I say performative publishing? This is a term I use in my own artwork, which is rooted in fine art, printmaking, and image reproduction processes. Publishing and printmaking are inherently active, process-based art forms. Fine art prints and art book publishing often require the use of shared studio spaces and equipment, engagement with multiple contributors, and demand complex planning and practice, akin to choreography. I'm interested in sharing the process and methodology behind the making of my work. In this way, I read my work in progress as I make it as a performance, and the resulting completed work often as a publication of that performance. With performance and many performative works, the documentation may be all that remains. This I'm seeing as the publication. For me, and in a greater conversation of contemporary art making, publications, of course, can range in scale, delivery, and scope. A distributable book object, like the one you're seeing here, for example, all the way to an oration, photographs published on a website, etc. As an educator teaching letterpress printing and publishing practices, I infuse my pedagogy with the ethos of performative publishing. Virginia Woolf's writing and research on her work in the Hogarth Press are foundational to how I teach letterpress printing, especially to students with an interest in literature. The examples of artists and their projects using this presentation are the very artists and projects that I share with student artists to help expand their definitions of art, art making, of textual applications in visual art, of what publishing looks and feels like, and most importantly, I think for our group today, of how to work with and respond to and create something new from another's work. This presentation weaves contemporary artist projects in direct response and influenced by the embodied readings of Virginia Woolf. Supported by how artists create and make their works, I read the performed labor of printing and publishing by Virginia Woolf as imbued in her words. Not in an effort to boost these particular artists necessarily, or claim that these projects are, capital S successful. I appreciate that aesthetic taste is widely vast, and I genuinely love that for teaching contemporary art practice and expanded interdisciplinary art practice, especially to student artists who are kind of defining their voices and practicing various gestures of art making. With that, we'll dive in. I want to start with a project by artist Molly Springfield, who is an American artist based in the DC area. Springfield makes graphite drawings that use photocopies of printed works as their source materials. In the slides, you'll see the scale of the works listed here, and I think that's really important. In these works that look like photocopies, they're achieving a trompe-l'oeil effect rather successfully. And one thing that may be difficult to glean from a digital presentation is really the scale. So this work in particular is quite large, 2 feet high by nearly 3 feet wide. The holograph draft series of Springfield's takes a look at source materials of Virginia Woolf's writings, holograph drafts in particular, and a reproduction that she found of Woolf's personal family photographs. I'm really struck by the act of kind of reproducing imagery and photocopies as Springfield does, the use of the hand, and in particular in this portrait, the overexposed face of Woolf, where the gaze is lost, and then in the upper right and the upper left hand corners, these kind of gestural mark making. It's like anonymized and personal at the same time. Another large scale work represented in a smaller scale on our screens, but I think perhaps if we can kind of supplant ourselves into the scale, kind of being able to follow these waves on the page, perhaps. These next 2 works, I think, are rather striking as a sort of flattening of maybe some of that personal gesture, thinking about Springfield really performing the act of the photocopier in this way. These marks that are flattened onto one layer of the draft from the waves here, and we're looking at maybe rhythmic striations that can follow wave patterns. Then some of these linear gestural marks, slashes perhaps, extracted and reproduced from Orlando. The next work that I want to share is in Forever by Barbara Kruger, who is a very accomplished 20th century contemporary artist and still producing work and making work and exhibiting. This is a presentation of her work in Berlin at Spruce Mayer's gallery, and this installation, a room wrap, created this immersive environment. The walls, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, are emboldened with Kruger's use of text and type, her kind of signature style of inverse black-white composition. And if you can kind of see this lens warped text extracting a quotation of a room of one's own, it's actually credited to Woolf at the very end of the word size. There's a sort of linear vertical, it's a little Woolf credit line there. This piece in particular, the scale is rather striking, and then it's kind of paired with this mirrored image on the other side of the room. These next two projects, I'm really interested in the ways in which the artists use the same source material to the Lighthouse to create a theatrical production. The artist Anne Hamilton and the experimental ensemble theater company, City Company, put together the Theater is a Blank Page, which has been presented a number of times. These images were collected from the Wexner Center for the Arts presentation of the work. This is an immersive and kind of participatory in some ways performance installation where the performance takes on the entirety of the theater. Audiences are led on stage through the balconies into the back rooms, the interior spaces of the theater. And the performance is set to a reading of excerpts from To the Lighthouse. So what we see here are the reader's hands as she kind of drags this ribbon of text along. The ribboning of text, the use of textiles, especially these long threads of text or strips of textile, is a motif that is common in Anne Hamilton's installation works. She's got a really lengthy career of making these large scale performance installations, often in kind of great spaces like this. And the performers in this piece are interacting with these strips of fabric that at one point create a really beautiful large scale woven tapestry that the audience participates in and kind of realizes what they're making as it's being made. The theater itself becomes then, of course, a stage, but also the kind of like conflation of set and space of the work. In an interview, Anne Hamilton says, "We've made a book that you sign out like with a library card when you arrive that is a copy of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. And so you can actually follow along and you have the weight of this thing in your hand and it's printed on newsprint. It has a quality, a little bit of a book and a score, and it has a pencil so you can mark it. We're really thinking about what's in your hand and what's in your lap, something that's really intimate and something that's far away." This next work by Brooke O'Hara and Sharon Hayes is a collaboration called Time Passes. It's been performed twice, once in 2011 and once in 2019. And this is another theatrical production of sorts, a performance piece with an 8-hour duration set to an audiobook recording of To the Lighthouse. That's a framework for this kind of immersive production in which the audience is kind of gathered in the space along with the performers, both O'Hara and Hayes, and their dog and their kid as the work evolves over time. I'm interested in how this piece in particular uses publication or uses a print and text. The initial image I shared, that overhead view of reads Time Passes, and this signage created very generously welcoming audience members. And I wanted to come back to this image, this cascading, almost quilt-like banner in the background that falls across the stage is actually a flyer installation that was organized by Sharon Hayes with another artist, Angela Baylor. And I appreciate this idea that since they're artists sharing their lives and the integration of this work into their lives for this 8-hour performance, that other artworks maybe filter in and kind of float past. This is an up close of a line that's strung across the kind of central component of the stage. And I want to think that these traveled across. The last project that I'll share is another collaboration. It's called A Workbook for Performance. It's by Audra Wolowiec and Jenny Crane. And this is a piece that falls under Audra Wolowiec's practice as what she calls sound texts. Audra Wolowiec is an interdisciplinary artist who works with sound, language, text, some publication, installation, sculpture, performance. This workbook for a performance, The Waves, was featured in a publication called Prompt, and that's a collaborative artist publication under the direction of Nicole Kack and Mira Dial. And an important part of this project of theirs is that they pair artists who otherwise hadn't worked together. So a lot of this project is based on these two artists working out their collaboration in real time together. The small insert sheet here is a handmade paper sheet made by Jenny Crane at Dieudonné Papermaking Studio. And this excerpt, this is a spread by Wolowiec that kind of is representative of some of their text-based works. And Jenny Crane, her contribution here is this kind of pairing of sorts, the manual for this. Jenny Crane was an artist and curator based out of New York, and her legacy is preserved by the Jenny Crane Foundation, which supports artists and curators and writers of any age at pivotal stages in their career. Crane's manual really collects some of that conversation and interlay between the two of them, Crane and Wolowiec, to produce this work, and also includes some inspiration points for them, texts including excerpts from The Waves 2006 edition, introduction by Molly Height, and then some imagery from environmental studies of global ocean current patterns that kind of take a form of almost like a dance chart patterning on the flip side here. With this work, I think it's really important to kind of draw back to a statement I made early on about performance documentation, and that this book in particular is a workbook for performance. It's anticipatory and wanting, and I find that to be kind of very exciting, and thinking about the use of Woolf works as generative and welcoming, inviting of reading and performing and work. Thank you.
I feel so lucky today to have been able to see and listen to these presentations. And I, as I look at the chat, I know that any questions that anyone has posed in there are lost in the sort of perpetual scrolling of people's responses and excitement about this. So if you have a question that you posed early in the chat, please put it back in the chat again. This may be a point where we need a couple of minutes just to try to think and synthesize what we've seen here. One of the things I've loved in all these presentations is the sort of confluence of visuality and materiality and textuality and yeah, all these stunning things. So if you'd like to pause before you pose a question, please do that. But if you have one ready now, please bring it either by raising your hand using the raise hand function. We have a few more people than I can see on the screen at any one time, or by putting it into the chat. While people are thinking, I want to ask a question of all the participants. Melissa foregrounded the question of craft, and we've talked about Woolf's essay craftsmanship and the way that she thinks about words and what it means to sort of deal with that aspect of craft. There's this ongoing sort of struggle, I know, between craft and high art, but also lots of people who are bringing those things together. And I wonder if any of the presenters today have thoughts about the role of craft in these visual and material and textual responses to Woolf.
I don't know if I have something specifically in response to Woolf yet, but one thing I would say is that I think the conversation, the argument between the quarrel between art and craft is incredibly interesting, but it's a historical conversation or it should be an entirely historical conversation. I know it isn't, because I have a lot of students in classes and some colleagues who are resistant in some ways to the idea of something done in a craft-based medium being brought up to the level of art, and then sometimes vice versa, of something that is clearly craft wanting to make it be art with a capital A, high art. Like this mug, which I love, one of my grad student made it, and it's artful. There's a lot of craftsmanship that goes into it. I think it's amazing, but I don't think it's a work of if we're thinking in a historical discourse, a work of high art. So it's a really complicated conversation, I think. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. Maybe let other people bring in some thoughts, and maybe I'll have something to say about Woolf specifically. Yeah.
I can chip in, but I suppose it's not a craft or whatever, but what you were saying made me think of the, I feel like illustration and or comics art are often sort of denigrated as, you know, not high art in a perhaps similar way. And interestingly, you know, we have this term graphic novel, which is used as a blanket term to describe things like mouse, which actually would come under something more to do with graphic memoir or graphic biography. But interestingly, also Art Spiegelman doesn't like the term graphic novel and thinks that we should just call it comics, which is essentially what it is. And it's almost, it's quite a, I don't know, why do we have to reach for it to have this sort of adult name that makes it feel like it's okay to read? I don't know. I'm not sure I've got the answer to that, but or really how I can relate it to Woolf. But I think I really appreciated, Melissa, what you said about calling it stitching rather than embroidery. Obviously, there's the sort of historical connotations of embroidery being, you know, something kind of not, which isn't high art. But I also, the reason I liked it was because it's so much more active, and it's kind of, I liked the sort of ongoingness of it, particularly given that you have these pieces that you're sort of continuing to work on and squirrel away at. So yeah, I might leave it there as well.
I'll just toss in my immediate reaction to this kind of question is in line with Melissa. You're like, oh, I want this to be a more historic argument, right? I also, I'm like, who is this? Who is this conversation for? Like, what are these distinctions? Like, why are we talking here rather than actually looking at the work or maybe engaging with the work? But one thing I will say in regards to craft and printing in particular is that we can think about printing in some ways of if craft is maybe ahead of the content, it's like, what is the content then? And if the content is ahead of the craft, is the content more urgent? Is the content more kind of prescient or like that need to kind of just get it out? And like, do we care if it's the margins are correct or are exacting? So those kinds of reads of craft maybe that lacks can reveal a lot of information if that's part of the intent of the artist or maker.
Yeah, I think so. I want to say that when I say I want the conversation to be historic, like in the past, I want the binary of it has to be either or to be in the past. And I like the idea that what is in the present is a working through and a back and forth and Ella, I'm thinking what you talked about with Spiegelman, what do we call that? And I think we look to the person who makes the object, makes the thing, and consider what they want rather than imposing some historical conversation upon them. And I think that's really important to think about.
I found myself wishing that the art and craft distinction were historical. There was a point where I had a textile studio in an art center, and they would have these open evenings, and there was a art teacher who was coming through with a student, and the student looked at my quilts and said, I don't think this was for my ears, is craft an art? Does craft belong in art? And I think that's still very much in people's minds. And I agree with you, Melissa, that I think we're at a point of teasing through that and using it as a generative thing as opposed to a partitioning. And yet, I think An has a question.
Thank you so much. It was such an inspiring panel, yeah, I'm just super inspired. I just wanted to ask, and first I want to also comment on the high art crafts. I don't think that there is a high art and then there's a craft. At least here in Norway, the crafts-based arts are the high arts, sort to say. So I think to distinguish these two, I think it doesn't make any sense. Maybe it made sense in the 90s, but it doesn't anymore. But I was wondering, this is both for Melissa and Ella. I noticed that also that this image where Virginia Woolf's mother quilting, and then the stitching. And I've also been very into this thing about letterpress printing as a way of quilting, and then you have stitching of books. And I think there's a very interesting, connection here. Do you have any reflection on that? Did you think about these connections as well when you saw each other's panels, presentations?
Yes, I definitely had in mind the kind of the element of sort of stitching books together when I drew that image, and again, thinking about myself as creator and stitching together my ideas, and it's all kind of a sort of good metaphor, but also there's so much fabric in general and in Woolf's work. And I think there was another panel that I showed you, or a couple of panels where I was trying to present her sort of bed sheets as being like the waves. And then in Melissa's talk too, had a quote from Woolf from the waves, which about the sea. She was using fabric as a metaphor for the sea. And I think there obviously is some connection there and a kind of continuum. And I was thinking about that stitching image when I was looking at Melissa's work, definitely.
So the opening sequence from the waves that Ella just mentioned, that's in some ways what got me interested in Woolf, or reinterested in Woolf, around 2008. I teach a course on collage and montage, and I taught the waves. And when we were reading that book, I started noticing all of the metaphors of textile that Woolf uses there, and it's not just textiles, but her reference to fiber and the reference to wool got me. And I started thinking about, and so here's where Woolf and craft come in. Maybe the thinking about Woolf paying attention to craft materials, the fact that Woolf knitted in the portrait that Belle makes of her was really wonderful for me to see. But then also thinking about the Omega Projects workshops or Omega workshops, and all of the materials that were created for that some of which Vanessa Bell created. And then, Woolf having a sister who is a painter. And so that relationship between craft and art, that there's this easy shift at times, it seems, moving back and forth between those two. I also, though, think of, the connection of text and textile. I put up that quote from Susan Howe's book, that has the reference that I wanted to talk about Gertrude Stein in some way, and so that gesture to Gertrude Stein's sentences where she's talking about a sewn in a sentence, it's all there. It's just this really, there are all these really beautiful connections, I think, that kind of swirl around and just, yeah.
Thank you so much. It just also reminds me of, there's a quote from Parallax that Nancy Cunard wrote that I really stuck to, where she writes, the years are sewn together with the thread of the same story, which I think is a sentence that kind of wraps up this project. So thank you so much.
You mentioned that in your talk earlier, and yeah, I want to read this now. I don't know it.
I was also just going to add, I think, you know, Woolf did have her own experience of craftsmanship when she was printing for the Hogarth Press. I think she's sort of often forgotten as a maker and an artist because of the, you know, her sister, that kind of being Vanessa's thing. But I think she was very like, very acutely aware of the relationship between writing and making.
Oh, Lisa, you have your hand up.
Well, I was ravished and slain by these. I mean, they're just gorgeous. And I wanted to make an argument for these kinds of responses to Woolf as their own kind of research, because I kept being reminded of my obsessive research into flowers and the meanings of flowers and the historical context of flowers, and how bringing that enriches everything you know about Woolf. And somehow particularly Melissa and Ella's images and the kind of obsessive detail and the kind of culminating of all the pieces together reminded me of my own research practice as a critic. And so I really, you know, I want to honor this not only for its beauty, but for the way it opens Woolf up and enriches and creates a real textural depth to our understanding of her. And I spent my career on Woolf working with visuals, but what this added for me was texture in a way that I had not anticipated it would at all. And another thing I wanted to just throw out to people is when I taught Woolf, I often assigned my students, made them do altered books, and they had to do a 2-page altered book spread for every week's assignment. And it was one of the richest sources of delight and understanding for them as readers of Woolf when they were asked to translate that reading process into a visual collage. And they produced work that, you know, astounded me in the depth of its understanding and also in its beauty. And so I'm thrilled with the whole panel and with the possibility of these kinds of reactions to Woolf really reverberating in the community. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alyssa. Can I just say
Alyssa,
that
maybe just before you respond, I want to go back to something from the chat from a few minutes ago that I think connects to what Elise is asking. And this is from Claire. She says, I wanted to invite the panelists to reflect on the relationship between reading and making, or making as a form of reading. It seems that in these craft and art and material practices, there's a way of engaging with textuality that perhaps echoes literary critical practice or close reading in its breaking apart of language, but there's something additionally affecting in some way about the artistic engagements. And so then she asks, do you have any thoughts about your own experience of the relationship between analytical and creative engagement?
I think what I was going to say, what fits into this. So Alyssa, thank you for that. I think I was trained as an art historian. You know, I knew how to, I learned embroidery from my mother and my grandmother. I had a little studio in the basement when I was a kid. But when I started teaching at Illinois State University in 2004, as an art historian, I teach in a school of art. And most of my students are studio artists or graphic designers or art educators who also make. And that has been a really, really important education for me in terms of how I think about my work as an art historian, that has to be highly analytical and objective, and how I was taught, how I absorbed art history is very different from how I want to be an art historian and today. I'm really resisting the idea that an art historian needs to be entirely objective. I mean, I have to be, of course, to a certain degree, but I have learned so much from my students and my studio colleagues, and that has become, and so learning in an embodied way from my students of how to make things has been huge. And I actually, in my seminar courses, 300 level seminar courses, they can write a research paper, but they can also do studio projects in response to what we're learning about. And at some point, I guess I thought, well, if they can do it, why can't I?
That's, for academics, it's such, I spent 25 years in printmaking studio when I was teaching, and I had I can't explain the richness of having the studio experience at the same time that I was doing the academic things. And yeah, it really shows. And your embroideries are just,
thank you,
lovely. They're just so, whew. I want to spend all my time doing stuff now instead of writing.
Well, it makes me think of a conversation in a panel from yesterday where somebody, actually it was Shiloh and Ben and Lacey's paper, where, you know, that it could be a model for a new way of working, of publishing. And
yes.
And I absolutely, I think the fact that I teach in a school of art, I have a lot of latitude and freedom to do what I want to do. And I am not in any way questioned. The only questioning comes from me. But I think that needs to become another model for how people outside of schools of art get to do research, do scholarship.
Yeah.
That scholarship can be creative. And I think of someone like Jen Bervin, who I brought up, but other people mentioned in the chat. And another artist who I really like, Larissa Nowicki, who is a London, do you know her work, Claire? So a London-based artist who works in response to Annie Albers. So anyways, yes, absolutely. We should be doing work differently.
One thing I wanted to add, it made me think about the study of book arts, the field of book arts as an opportunity to think about the book as an object, as an aesthetic object, in addition to an object that can be read. So thinking about close reading and close looking at the same time, in the same pace, like needing to look through and look at something, at a content and a form, and that kind of duality. So thinking about some opportunities of critique in that kind of bifurcated lens.
I think I was just going to say, from my perspective, I did an English degree and then I did an MA in illustration. So I moved from, I moved from a sort of, well, I went to Oxford, and then it was obviously a very academic, traditional environment, and then went to art school. And I found that jump very difficult because they're totally different environments. But I like to think that I brought some of the like academic practice to my art while I was there. And I still think that now when I approach creating something, I do so almost as if I'm about to write an essay. I think through it as if it were an essay, an academic essay, but create it as if it were a piece of art, or try to. So yeah, I can kind of hear what you're saying, and I think that it's all sort of on a spectrum of thinking through something. And yeah, I like the idea of a sort of more holistic approach to research.
Can I just barge in? I've had my hand up.
Oh,
Wonderful panel. Wonderful panel. I just want to point out on the subject of needlework that there is a terrific book called Bloomsbury Needlepoint. And it's by Melinda Koss, C-O-S-S. I can't make my chat work. I can type stuff in and I can't send it. So I want to point out that this book, Bloomsbury Needlepoint, is from the tapestries at Charleston Farmhouse. And it has charts of designs by Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell, and Roger Fry. I used to do needlepoint, and I bought this in London because I was really ambitious. And I thought I would try to do some of these, but I haven't. But the book is great, and I just want to recommend it. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks, Shiloh, for putting what I think is the information that Diane has just given us into the chat. And Shiloh, you have your hand up too, I think.
I'll retype it too if it's not correct, Diane. I just wanted to get it down for people in case it is correct.
Great.
Yeah, I first of all just want to thank the three of you for being here. I was very alternately moved and excited to have the three of you in this room together, who are, both artists, crafters, and scholars, and women. It's just, there's an incredible energy here for me that is profoundly moving. So thank you for being here. Ella and Melissa will both have work based on these two projects forthcoming in issue 99 of the Virginia Woolf Miscellany. So I want to encourage you to check their work out in the next issue. And Ella generously came to talk to my Woolf seminar several years ago at Wells when we did not have the affordances of Zoom, in a sort of transatlantic, Skype adventure. And it was tremendously rewarding for my students. And it's so wonderful to see you again here. And so I guess my question is finally turns to Leah Mackin, who I've had the privilege to work with and think about printing and a kind of expanded pedagogy in terms of teaching literature. So one of the things about Wells College, where we were both working, is that they have a tremendously well-appointed book art center. And so as part of my classes in literature, 18th century literature, Woolf, and so on, we could often, I had the privilege of collaborating with Leah, who would run printing workshops for my students. For example, in my Coffee House Convos class, she helped them print up satirical pamphlets where students would actually get to engage the materiality of that printing, dissing the type, putting the type together, printing with their own hands, which I think does change how they feel about the materiality of literature. And so that was incredibly important. Leah, you are also a practicing artist. And so I was wondering if any of this, if you could talk a little bit more about your own process and your folds and the books that you're making, the stitching, and the, you're super into tactility, because I'm always seeing these images from you that have that sort of tactile affect. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that in my goals of for the presentation today, I was just really interested in thinking about like how I use Woolf in teaching. And I think that these examples in particular are ones that I've turned to. And now I'm excited to add Melissa and Ella's projects into the mix moving forward in this regard. But yeah, in regard to my own process and thinking about tactility in particular, yeah, I think I think that there's a sensitivity to the intimacy of reading and thinking about how the relationship between the object and the reader is like this, right? I mean, we're in an opportunity to kind of be close and one-on-one. We're working at our own pace. We can go back pages. I am admittedly, I have a difficult time reading, and I have for most of my life, and my education has been kind of dotted with times where I'm not able to actually absorb text on a page. But when I'm thinking about how to work through texts, I reread, I take snippets out and think about how they appear on the page, you know, how those words actually are. And as you might imagine, a visual learner, and I can hold information based on how I rewrite it in a notebook, for example, right? So then my works, I think kind of employ, I guess, that opportunity to think about like the scatter, think about floating text or warped text, kind of transforming maybe some language in particular. How's that?
Thank you. Yeah, and I just
yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, I didn't include any of my personal work in the presentation, and I referenced it, but I wasn't sure exactly how to sneak it in, and so thank you. Appreciate that.
And I did put a link to both Leah's website and Ella's website where you can see their artwork. I will promote them so that they don't have to promote themselves.
Yeah, I'm really taken with what you just said about the sort of difficulty of reading. And I guess in part because the pandemic time transformed me from a voracious reader into a completely blocked reader. And
I think that was a common occurrence for people, the inability to almost just be absorbed in reading practice, or to be able to focus for that time.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I'm glad
you're
you did,
not the first person.
Right. And I've seen many people talk about this and, you know, lamented on Twitter. And one of the things I really love about what you just said is how repositioning the text into a different mode or a different materiality can offer a way of dealing with that difficulty. And it makes me think about the way that in a number of presentations in On's session earlier, in yesterday's keynote, there were discussions of Woolf as a difficult writer. And you know, that sort of, and so now I'm sort of ruminating on, and I have nothing useful to say yet about the physical difficulty of reading, and then this sort of intellectual difficulty of reading. I'm thinking a lot about the way those things maybe come together.
Right. And I guess I think I heard On say that earlier in her presentation, and I've heard that again and again as well. And Melissa, yeah, your comment here in the chat, Woolf can be hard and exhausting. And I think for me, just because reading, for example, has been difficult, doesn't mean that I didn't like want to try to work through it. And there's an opportunity to think about like the power of a challenging read, and what we get out of persevering through it, right? So yeah, On, maybe.
I'm just, can I chip in or somebody, oh, sorry, somebody. Okay, I was just going to say I'm going to use this opportunity to promote graphic novels because I find that if I'm struggling to read, there's a sort of ease of transmission in some ways that that makes graphic novels they're just so easy to pick up. Partly they're shorter to read because there's obviously fewer words, but also there's just something more I don't know, more exciting or vibrant, I suppose, about reading something which also has pictures. And yeah, obviously you're kind of meant to read the words and the images in conjunction, but it as I said, the sort of the way that it transmits onto you when there is an image there to sort of help elucidate the text or add something to the text, it's just much easier and to my mind more enjoyable often, particularly if you're in a bit of a slump with reading. So yeah, I would recommend graphic novels or short stories, but for my purposes, graphic novels.
I see your hand up.
Yeah, 100% agree, Ella. I love graphic novels. I was also thinking about this. I think you said, Leah, the difficulty of reading, and then also a lot of people in visual arts and also graphic design that don't really read that much. And it's very strange that so many of them also have like dyslexia and things. But I think it's also very interesting when we have read things, sometimes we read things out loud, and then even though they're not kind of very literate, they can turn out with something that is very, I don't know, rich and text-based. And I don't know if it's something about also breaking it down and discussing it, because maybe in my profession, we don't really discuss text in the way that you're trained in more like academic, and I think that would something that I would really like to bring in into kind of courses with students. Yeah, I think that was just a reflection of what you said, but yeah, but I can really relate to that difficulty of reading, and especially I thought it was much easier to read during the pandemic because it wasn't so many things going on, and I could have like more calmly read a lot of books. But now that the world's kind of on fast forward again, I think I find it much harder to read books, and then I've gone back to more graphic novels because I think they can easier hold the attention and not being disturbed. Thank you.
I was just going to add, I think the ease of reading a graphic novel is perhaps one of the just to go back to a point I made earlier, is perhaps one of the things that makes people see it as not a high art, because I suppose there's a sort of fallacy that something should be difficult to read and that will make it literary, and because they're enjoyable to read, then they're seen as a kind of for kids or yeah, kind of I don't know, trivial. But yeah, there's been loads of really amazing suggestions of some really literary and interesting and really good reads in the graphic novel sphere in the chat. So definitely, I think everybody should check them out.
And can I just say, I'm really impressed because I know how much hard work it is into making a graphic novel, and then it is such a generous thing to do that effort for everyone who gets to read it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a labor of love, definitely.
I'm going to pause us for a moment and say that it is 12:30, which is the official ending of this session. But I'm happy to keep the session open for as long as people want to talk, although I suppose at some point we'll have to close it. But before we do that, for those who are wanting to leave, let's take a moment to thank these three incredible presenters and their gifts to us.
Well, people are sort of ducking out. Just to add on, there's in the new issue of the Virginia Woolf Miscellany, there will also be an article on Woolf and Alison Bechdel and graphic art as well. And a beautiful essay by Marie Allegre on Woolf and reading, Woolf and language. So
How much longer do we have to wait for this miscellany? I'm so excited for it.
And the articles are all in, they need to be formatted. So it's in more of a, now it's an editorial. Yeah, it's an editorial game, I guess, at this point. After the conference, I think is the actual answer. So yeah.
Great. Wow.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
I'm dying to hear what Leslie's thinking, because she, like me, is an academic who, you know, mid-career also became engaged in visual arts. She just disappeared from my screen.
Well, that probably means she's not here.
Oh,
Yeah, she
dear.
It's there but muted.
Thank you all for coming to this panel and participating. I was so excited. Melissa, when I saw your abstract, I didn't want to just pair you with another, just like fully textual panel. And so I reached out to Leah and to Ella so that they could be your companions in this panel. And I'm so excited to hear the three of you present together. So thank you for being the occasion for bringing everybody together, your abstract for being the occasion to make this panel happen.
Thank you.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been such a treat, and I'm so pleased to see more and find out more about both of your work, Leah and Melissa.
Same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very exciting to me.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shiloh, for inviting us.
Yay. I think it's part of why I sort of teared up when you were talking. I was like, oh no, I'm crying again. This conference has made me cry multiple times. So.
Aww.
Okay. I'm going to run to Rita's translation workshop. So also, but thank you all so much. You're amazing and wonderful. Beautiful geniuses. Bye.
Thank you, Shiloh.
Melissa,
Bye.
did I hear that you're working on a book about people doing art about Woolf?
Yeah. So it's either it might be a book, or it might just be a series of essays that are published in different places. Right now, I'm a little overwhelmed by the idea of writing a whole book on this and waiting until that's done to publish it. I'd much rather, and I have tenure, right? I need to publish it as a book in order.
The luxury of willfulness, yes.
Yeah. Yes, and so Leah, I was so excited by the artists that you chose to talk about. I love all of them. And I'm curious, have you seen the Theater is a Blank Page? Have you gotten to see it?
No, I haven't, but I will seek it out. I will travel to make it happen.
You should.
I did share a YouTube clip in my shared Google Doc.
Right.
It just looked phenomenal.
It's amazing. I got to go to Los Angeles and got to see 2 performances of it. But if you want to, City Company is very welcoming to scholars. So, and they've made videos of all of their performances. And so you can request to go to their offices and you can sit at a monitor and watch the Theater is a Blank Page, but also I'll give a shout out to the play Room, which is a 1-person play with Ellen Lauren, based on A Room of One's Own and other writings by Woolf. So I'm writing about Room, I'm writing about the Theater is a Blank Page. Yeah.
Thank you for the city tip.
Yeah, I'm writing about a lot of the artists that you spoke about. So it's exciting to see that. Yeah.
I see Leslie is back. Have her say something about her Making Waves press.
Oh,
I thought someone mentioned my name just as I was leaving before.
Yes.
And I thought, whoa, does that look guilty or something? No, I have my own press, a press of my own, very small, in my basement. And but a lot of what I do is actually digital. And like I did a society using film clips as the illustration. So I realized when I was thinking about the graphic novels, I thought, well, how does this play into this? You know, how would you use, is it a graphic short story? In some ways it's not drawn, but it's selected stills from the early suffragette films. I don't know. So that's what I do in terms of a press of my own.
Has that been published?
Yes,
Or
in fact, I just am launching it at this conference.
Oh, exciting.
Oh, that's very exciting.
It's in the new thing she sent out from different presses because there was a problem with the link in the earlier one.
Okay.
Yes, but you've also done letterpress.
Oh, yes, I do letterpress. And I got my certificate from the University of Iowa Center for the Book for letterpress arts, but paper is actually what I love to do, paper making. So I've done some big installations of waves and things along those lines.
Alyssa, is that one of Leslie's behind you now? Oh, okay. I thought you changed your background, so I thought maybe it was.
Oh, I'm advertising. I also want to get a
yours
word in for the academics who do art on the side, rather than just the artists who work with Woolf. And so Suzanne Bellamy and I have been best buddies for decades, because I'm a printmaker too, and then this is one of my woodcuts
beautiful
in the background.
Monk's
And so I started Monk's House. I did a series of house prints of Monk's House and Roundhouse and Charleston, and there's some others that aren't finished. And then I did a digital rendition of Talon House called Talon House Ghosts. That's like 27 different images from Woolf's family albums superimposed on a photo I took of Talon House. So and Leslie, and the reason I was called out for Leslie to talk is that she has taken a similar journey as me, which is to begin as in English and then to gradually move into art making as sometimes almost a full